On the 27th of August 1933, in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering, both veterans of the First World War, paid tribute to Field Marshal von Hindenburg in the awe-inspiring setting of the monument to the Battle of Tannenberg. Hitler declares that Tannenberg is a symbol. It was here, in 1914, that Germany's destiny was determined. For Hindenburg, 20 years earlier, the Battle of Tannenberg had been the defining event of his life. Millions of men are caught in the machinery of a war that will be short and glorious, or so the generals and heads of state promise. Instead, the war becomes one of deadlock and fear. In France, there is fear on the home front. As the Germans advance on Paris, there's a run on the banks to empty personal accounts. Many flee, storming train stations. But the Ferrari family remains home in L'Étang-la-Vie, near Paris. These are some of the first images of daily life in the war's early weeks. The grandfather gives a military salute. He appears confident in the French army. Thousands of refugees from Belgium, northern France, and the Champagne region flee the advancing Germans. The war forces families from their homes, from their lives. The same panic strikes East Prussia in northern Germany, where the Russians have attacked. The generals execute their strategic plan, opening a new front which eases the pressure on their French ally. The Russian steamroller, made up of two imperial armies totaling 400,000 men, threatens Berlin. Russian soldiers sing farewell to their country. But the Russian soldiers may struggle to understand why they must march hundreds of miles and cross the border to defend their homeland. For the most part, they are peasants. Many can neither read nor write, and they will leave no journals or letters. In his novel August 1914, the Russian author Solzhenitsyn describes the buoyant mood. The regiment is a sort of village, the officer a sort of squire, and so long as meals, mass and vodka are offered, bullets hold no terror for them. On the 20th of August 1914, the Russian army advances through East Prussia, seemingly invincible. Along with thousands of civilians, the German 8th Army retreats. General von Hindenburg takes over command. To reassure the public, the general is filmed in conversation. with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Alongside Hindenburg is General Ludendorff, who has earned praise for the Belgian campaign. Hindenburg and Ludendorff appear unconcerned. They make a formidable team. As Hindenburg puts it, it is a happy marriage. Hindenburg and Ludendorff know they are outnumbered. They have only 200,000 men under their command, half as many as the Russians. But they are better armed and can move their troops more efficiently through strategic rail transport. Morale among the troops is high. Many of them come from East Prussia. They are defending their homeland. Ludendorff deploys the dirigibles of Count Zeppelin, huge hydrogen-filled airships that enable him to observe enemy movements. The Germans are able to transmit vital information. The two Russian armies are too far apart to come to each other's aid. The time is right for a German attack, starting with General Samsonov's army, which is nearing Tannenberg. The Germans take 90,000 prisoners. 30,000 Russians are killed or wounded. General Samsonov tells his officers, "The Emperor trusted me. How can I face him again after such a disaster?" And he puts a bullet through his head. The Second Russian Army is decimated in turn. The defeat is a terrible blow to Russia's French and British allies, who seek to cover it up. German refugees from East Prussia return to their villages, but they are rarely able to return to their homes. Their fate has shaken the nation's morale. To boost spirits, the Germans film the surviving troops, who receive triple rations. 10,000 of their comrades have fallen in battle. Hindenburg is named Field Marshal. He becomes a national hero. Ludendorff, the real architect of the victory, is overlooked. At Russian headquarters, Tsar Nicholas II arrives in his special train. He meets his uncle, the commander-in-chief of his armies, Grand Duke Nicholas. An authoritarian giant, he plays down the disaster at Tannenberg. For him, the real enemy is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He says, the war started in Austria. The way to Berlin lies through Austria-Hungary. The Russians are able to conquer Galicia, at the time an Austrian province, and its main city, Lemberg. The Cossack cavalry advances 120 miles. Austria loses many thousands of men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The POWs are a cross-section of the Slavic peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and Bosnians. A Russian propaganda film shows an Austro-Hungarian prisoner fraternizing with a Russian soldier, two Slavs in opposing uniforms. They are filmed as symbols of Russia's desire to unite all Slavs in its empire. Nicholas II's smile after this initial victory against the Austrians masks the loss of 210,000 Russian casualties in 3 weeks of war. On a front 370 miles long, 7 German armies, 2 million men in all, invade France. The First Army of General von Kluck crosses the River Somme. The German officers rally their troops, saying victory is close. The triumphant entry into Paris awaits you. The German infantrymen have marched 250 miles since the heavy fighting in Belgium of August 1914. The commander of the Brandenburg Regiment tells them, "We must allow the enemy no rest. Sweat saves blood." Even as they retreat, the French continue the fight. They are at the limits of their endurance. The heat is unbearable. Few men have washed or taken off their boots for a month. Blood oozes from the backs of the horses that are seldom unsaddled. But it is an orderly retreat by the French and British. The 1st Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, which arrived in France on August the 13th, has marched 185 miles. Before assembling to hear the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir John French, tell them that the situation is grave. Will France's colonial troops save the country? Ever since they landed in the south of France, the African troops have been marching northwards. Many prefer to go barefoot rather than wear their heavy army boots. Before their arrival, a French senator says with concern, neither the climate nor the food of France is suited to them. A general reassures him. They are disciplined, strong, and devoted to their leaders. One of these Senegalese infantrymen obediently carries his captain's deck chair. All around Paris, the defense forces organize, using any and every means. But on the 2nd of September 1914, news comes from 2 French aviators who have returned from a reconnaissance flight over enemy lines. The German forces are changing direction. Rather than carry on to Paris, the German armies swerve in an attempt to encircle the French army, thus opening themselves to an attack by the French and British along the Marne River. The commander of the forces defending Paris, General Gallieni, orders the swift transport of 6,000 men to the Marne in Parisian taxicabs. The government has this huge propaganda operation filmed to boost French morale. The Marne River taxis are hailed as the saviors of Paris, but in reality their contribution to the battle is minimal. They carry only a fraction of the million Frenchmen preparing for battle. The French commander-in-chief is General Joseph Joffre. He has his officers read the day's orders to his soldiers advancing to the front. At the moment when a battle is about to begin, upon which hangs the fate of France, a troop that cannot advance must at any cost hold on to the conquered ground and be killed there rather than retreat. No weakness can be tolerated. The soldiers are afraid. They know that court-martials await those who waver. If they retreat, they will be executed by their own. If they advance, they will be killed by the enemy. French artillery units prove to be extremely effective, thanks to the 75mm cannons, which can fire 20 rounds a minute. They consume an astronomical number of shells, some 100,000 shells a day, 200 million shells for the entire war. They are manufactured by women who work in miserable conditions. On the 9th of September, the French and British are victorious, but only after human carnage on a terrible scale. The French historian Marc Bloch, a sergeant at the time, writes, "A severed leg lies on the ground, ridiculous in its horror. A revolting stench turns the stomach." The fighting has left 200,000 dead or wounded on the French side, and just as many Germans. Young women from comfortable families sign up as nurses. Known as Angels of Mercy, they are wrested from a sheltered adolescence and must learn to endure the terrible screams of mutilated young men and the constant, unbearable odor of blood, ether, and gangrene. The unimaginable number of wounded and dead does not deter military and political leaders. General Joffre, decorating colonial troops, proclaims, "As their cruel but glorious losses testify, the native infantrymen have carried out their duty admirably." Curiously, patriotism among the troops also remains high. Despite the slaughter, many continue to think the war will end soon. Private Pierre Branguier writes to his wife, "I have not given up hope of returning this November. I cannot imagine that the nations involved can keep up their incredible effort much longer." The French are permitted a brief period of rest. The general, affectionately nicknamed Papa Joffre, expresses his concern for the survivors. He is filmed here tasting the soldiers' stew. They have saved Paris. But a young cavalry officer, René Chambre, writes, "The Battle of the Marne, we won the battle and lost the victory." The French and the British allow the Germans to flee towards the north of France in a series of outflanking maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. During those 3 months of battle, other German units complete their conquest of Belgium. The German military seeks to win over the local inhabitants. But the plundering and requisitions to feed the soldiers quickly spells starvation for Belgian citizens. Among these German soldiers is an obscure Austrian painter who has enlisted in the German army. 25-year-old Adolf Hitler will be forever marked by the hell he experiences in Flanders. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler will write, "The pride of the fighting soon turned into nightmare." For 4 years, the British refused to abandon the area around the Belgian town of Ypres. This small strip of Belgium must remain in Allied hands. That is the wish of the Belgian King Albert I, to whom King George V pays a visit of support. A Belgian military doctor, Major Max Dovey, says, "Holding our position is God's command, even if death awaits us all." Ypres is the last British stronghold in the north. In the Battle of Passchendaele, it will become the tomb of hundreds of thousands of men. To fill the ranks, back at home the British train increasing numbers of fighting men. But not always from the UK. They are drawn from across the empire, and all are subjects of His Majesty. Seen here with his piercing blue eyes, King George V takes time to inspect the troops. After disembarking in the ports of France, these Canadians march to the front. But are they ready to wage war? In October, the Germans, determined to hold on to the regions they have conquered, begin to dig, or force civilians to dig for them, a network of fortifications in the oozing clay of Flanders. The heavy soil is waterlogged because the Belgians deliberately opened their dikes to flood the region. The Germans work hard to make these termite colonies livable. But winter will transform them into freezing crypts. The British dig in too. They prepare to hold the front in Flanders, which is now at a stalemate. A war of constant manoeuvring is replaced by a war of holding position. Further south, the French make do with more or less interconnected foxholes. The French High Command refuses to condone the troops installing themselves in trenches organized for defense. The soldiers know that their officers think only of attack. The Germans must be driven out of the French provinces they occupy, behind what is now a line of trenches 435 miles long that stretches from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The French observe the enemy trenches by means of devices that sometimes prove perilous for the brave artillery spotters. In the winter of 1914, General Joffre launches vast offensives that are stopped dead by German machine guns. These offensives are meant to take pressure off the Russian front. They leave 100,000 men dead or wounded. 20,000 die, merely to capture the lonely peak of a forgotten mountain. On All Saints' Day, Pope Benedict XV addresses the world. He says, "This war is the suicide of Europe. There appears no limit to the destruction and carnage. Day after day, fresh blood is spilt on the earth. In view of this senseless crime, I repeat unto you, peace on earth, to men of good will." Will the Pope's words be heard? There are moments of spontaneous fraternization on the front, as these rare images show. These men risked being shot for treason. No one knows what became of them, and their celebrations were quickly stifled. The generals remain deaf and blind. The military, already very powerful at the beginning of the war, is starting to dominate politics and politicians. Despite the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, the conflict spreads. In Africa, the French, British and Belgians attack the German colonies of Togo, Cameroon, Tanganyika, Rwanda and Namibia. Their goal is to enlarge their colonial empires and obtain the raw materials needed for the war industry. Many Africans are lured by the soldiers' proud uniform and good pay. In the unspeakable conditions, these troops will fight with loyalty and courage. "100,000 Africans and 30,000 Europeans will lose their lives in Africa, victims of ferocious fighting and diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and especially malaria." In Asia, to honor its treaty of alliance with Great Britain, Japan has fought the war against Germany from the beginning. The Japanese take the opportunity to help themselves to the German enclave in China, the port of Tsingtao, where there's a German brewery that produces a beer known to this day. Japan, on the rise economically and militarily, demonstrates its superiority by shelling the German defences for 7 straight days. While the fighting in Europe becomes bogged down, the conflict spreads to the Middle East. On November the 23rd, 1914, in Jerusalem, then part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire allied with the Germans, from the minarets come calls for a holy war to rally Muslim fighters against the French, British and Russians. The Ottoman Empire occupies a strategic position. Its capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul in Turkey, is the home of the Hagia Sophia Basilica, which has been turned into a mosque. Constantinople commands the passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire reaches as far as the Persian Gulf and threatens the Suez Canal, a vital artery for the British and a major shipping route for supplies to the Western Front. The Ottoman sovereign is Sultan Mehmed V, seen here receiving the German monarch Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II is worried about diplomatic maneuvering by the British, who tried to buy Turkey's allegiance. But the Germans outbid them. The Sultan is a ruler in name only. Real power lies with a nationalist organization, the Young Turks. Its leader is Enver Pasha. Educated in Germany, he leads an army of 1 million men, trained and supervised by Germans. The Germans are counting on his armies to provide relief in the fight against Russia. Enver Pasha decides to attack Russia, Turkey's hereditary enemy, in the Caucasus, the border region inhabited by Muslims. The Ottomans hope these Muslims will rise up against the Tsar if a holy war is declared. The Turks, fearsome warriors, have already fought the Russians, who hold the passes, and who have deployed their troops in the mountains to draw the enemy towards the summits. During a previous war against the Turks, a Russian general said, "The Caucasus is a fortress, and only a madman would attempt to scale it." But on December the 22nd, 1914, in the middle of winter, Enver Pasha launches an attack in the mountains near Sarıkamış. The attack fails. Defeated, the 70,000 soldiers of the Turkish Third Army die of the cold or are finished off as they retreat. Not a single Muslim, either in Russia or among its allies, rose up for the Holy War. The party in power, the Young Turks, and Enver Pasha need a scapegoat. They settle on Turkey's Armenian community, who are Christians. Intellectuals and community leaders are the first to be targeted. Rapes and beatings are commonplace. The Armenians who survived the first massacres are led to camps in the Syrian desert, hundreds of miles away. Exhausted, beaten, and denied food and water, most die along the way. According to the Republic of Turkey, 300,000 Armenians died. Armenian and most international estimates exceed 1 million. This dark chapter of history will divide Armenian and Turkish communities the world over for decades to come. In March 1915, a joint British and French fleet tries to force the Dardanelles Strait, to take Constantinople and prevent Bulgaria from entering the war alongside the German and Ottoman empires. The Turks have powerful cannons and underwater minefields. They sink 3 battleships. After the defeat, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty and mastermind of the mission, is forced to step down. But some believe those responsible for the disaster are the admirals and generals. In their continued contempt and underestimation of the Turks, 1 month later they venture a landing on the coast of Turkey at Gallipoli to seize the enemy batteries. On April the 25th, 1915, Australian and New Zealand forces, together with British and French contingents, are dropped on the narrow beaches. From high on the steep slopes, the Turks fire on them with impunity. The Turks are well armed, well equipped, and well commanded. Pinned down, the Allied troops endure months of agony. Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, the British war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, writes, "It is the most ghastly military fiasco in our history. The generals had no maps and a vague idea of the nature of the ground in their front, and no adequate steps were taken to keep the troops supplied. The Australian volunteers have nothing to drink under a beating sun." Three months later, using his own camera, Ashmead Bartlett films these same men, now starving and feverish. They know that 150,000 men have been killed here in vain. Bulgaria has swung over to the German side. The Dardanelles remain in Turkish hands. The Daily Telegraph's correspondent directly addresses Herbert Asquith, the British Prime Minister, causing a scandal. "Mr. Prime Minister, I am not sure you are aware of the true state of affairs out here, or to what extent the generals keep you informed. Here, in Gallipoli, we are dissipating a large portion of the Empire's fortune and have not yet gained a single acre of ground of any strategic value. This futile expedition may ruin our prospects of wearing down Germany's colossal military power." Germany's power, embodied by the victor of East Prussia, Marshal von Hindenburg, has its limits. The toll of German dead and wounded is turning public opinion against the war. In April, in The Hague in the Netherlands, which remains neutral, the International Women's Congress for Peace demands an immediate end to hostilities. But just the opposite happens. The conflict expands again. On the 23rd of May 1915, Italy enters the war. A neutral power in the early months of the war, it was nonetheless allied with Germany. Britain and France promised to return to Italy the cities of Trento and Trieste, which are still in Austrian territory. Italy changes sides. A patriotic anti-Austrian fervour sweeps Italy, fed by the grandiloquent verses of the nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. "You are the raging sparks of the sacred blaze. May all voices be a single flaming cry. Italia! Italia!" These young Italians have no idea of the hardships ahead as they march into the Alpine War. In France, the front is deadlocked in the trenches, though punctuated by attacks as deadly as they are futile. Private Charles Gaillard writes, "Here morale is very poor. We're fed up with fighting but not advancing. and the peasants envy their cows, which are bedded more comfortably than they are. The enemy is on the other side of a sea of barbed wire, which seems to stretch to infinity. Given the impasse, the Germans decide to strike a major blow in the east, in the part of Poland still under Russian rule. Certain of his success, the new German commander-in-chief, General von Falkenhayn, authorizes 33-year-old American journalist Wilbur Derborough and his crew to follow the German army for 6 months. They travel in a Stutz, a luxury American convertible, led by a German military guide. Derborough is clearly proud of his scoop. In the United States, which is still officially neutral, hostility towards Germany surges after a German submarine torpedoes and sinks the British liner SS Lusitania on May 7, 1915. The Germans say the attack is justified because the Lusitania was transporting ammunition. Proof to back up this claim will not emerge until years later. But the darkening mood at home does not stop Derborough from enjoying his travels with these German officers. He presents an affectionate portrait of the Kaiser's troops relaxing before the attack. After the German victory in Poland, Derborough films thousands of Russian prisoners. Then, accompanied by a police contingent armed with whips, he films the Jews in the Jewish quarter. And he captures pictures of the German army's victory march into Warsaw on August 4, 1915. Other war cameramen capture images of Germany's might. As Zeppelins bomb London, the British realize that the heart of their empire is now vulnerable. A new kind of warfare is born, industrial warfare, a war of destruction, of annihilation. The aim now is to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Assembly lines turn out a flood of even deadlier inventions. Grenades of all kinds, bombshells of every caliber, a variety of poison gases, proud achievements of scientific research. How will mankind endure this voyage to the heart of darkness?